Hello everyone and welcome to my Season 14 guide to Jayce mid. Jayce is one of those champions that a lot of people stay away from because it has a reputation of being very difficult to play. And there is definitely some skill required, but I don't think it's as hard as people say. And by the end of this video, if you listen to the whole thing, you have a very good idea on how to make it work. So why then should you add Jayce to your champion pool, and what is his identity? Well, first off, Jayce is probably just the strongest AD mid in the game right now. So if you want an AD mid in your pool, it's definitely a good place to start. On top of that, he's probably the most blindable AD mid for a couple of reasons. One, he's ranged, and that generally makes things a little bit easier. And on top of that, he's a flex pick. So a lot of the time, if you pick Jayce, people might think it's going top, or people just might not know what to pick into Jayce mid to begin with. He's also just a great one-trick champion because of that same flexibility. You can play mid-top and just play Jayce exclusively. You can also play Jayce AD carry. I won a Jayce ADC game in Challenger the other day, so it definitely works. So overall, it's just a really nice champion to fill some of the holes in your champion pool, or just build a champion pool around. As for his identity, you can kind of think of Jayce as an AD control mage, except he also comes with a lot of DPS and fights, and to be honest, the champ is just quite overtuned overall. One thing that I really like about Jayce is how smooth his power curve is. Like, there's never really a stage of the game where you feel like you're weak. And in fact, despite having a pretty strong lane, maybe not the strongest, but a relatively strong lane, he also scales incredibly well. And there's never really a stage of the game you feel weak, except for maybe ultra late game if people get a lot of lifesteal before you get strong. But outside of that, you're always going to have pressure. You're going to be able to get prior of your lane. You're going to be able to take skirmishes and fights at pretty much every stage. You're strong in side laning. You're really good at taking camps. So you'll find that Jayce can do just about everything. The only thing Jayce is really lacking is a little bit in the CC department. You have some utility with your speed up, and you do, I suppose, have some CC with your Q slow and your E knockback, but it's definitely not the best. Overall, though, it's an extremely powerful champion and one that you guys are definitely going to want to have a look at. Now on to Jayce's runes. So there are 4 rune pages that you need to be aware of in Jayce, but there are 2 main ones, which are Phase Rush and First Strike, so we'll start with those ones first. So for our first strike page, this is your default page. If you're not sure what to take in your matchup or the game or whatever, just take Phase Rush. And Phase Rush is very good on Jayce because it's very easy to proc. It's quite useful for trading in the early game. It's also very useful for avoiding ganks. It can be great in team fights for when you go in, you deal your damage and you still manage to get out. So overall, Phase Rush, very solid page. You'll be taking Mana Flow, Absolute Focus, and then either Gathering Storm or Scorch. Just kind of up to you. If you feel like you can pressure the lane a lot, you can go Scorch. Sometimes, though, it is hard to actually proc this on cooldown as Jayce, especially early game. So a lot of the time, I like to go Gathering Storm, even in lanes where I think I can actually pressure. And then for your secondaries, you will most likely want to go Inspiration. If you're in a lane where the enemy mid has skill shots and you want boots early, then you probably want Triple Tonic. Triple Tonic overall is actually a pretty good rune, and Jayce does benefit from the extra skill point. That being said, I think if you can get away with taking boots, you probably should. And the reason is that boots are not that big a spike on Jayce in terms of, it's not like buying Sork shoes on a mage or something. So I don't know. It's still useful to pick up boots in the early game, but I like to get away with magical footwear if I can. And of course, the other rune will just be Cosmic Insight. It's very broken. So yeah, just take that all the time. For our charge, just go double adaptive force and of course, scaling HP. Now, there's one more thing you can do. If you're in a very difficult lane, so let's say you're laning against like a Syndra or an Ori or something, you might want to take Resolve second and then go for Second Wind and Overgrowth. You don't really want to do this. It's more just there are some very difficult mage poke matchups that if you get through the very early game, once you get to kind of like your Dirk power spike, you should be in a good spot. But in those early levels, it can be really hard, and a Resolve secondary page can help you get through that. The second main rune page that you're going to use is the First Strike page. The First Strike page gives you a ton of scaling and a lot of damage, and basically if you can get away with it, it's probably the best rune. So you should be looking to take this if you don't need Phase Rush and you don't need the other specific runes that we're going to talk about. So with this page, again, Magic Boots or Triple Tonic, depending on matchup. If you can get away with Boots, generally it's better. You are going to want to take Biscuits, and that's because we're going to need the mana since we're going to be dropping Mana Flow. We're going to be taking Absolute Focus and Gathering Storm, which gives us a lot of scaling pressure. But we are a little lacking in the early game, and especially our early trades and gank avoidance is going to suffer for not having Phase Rush. But if you can get away with this page, it gives insane scaling and allows you to get to your mid-game spikes even faster. Next, we have a couple more situational rune pages. So the first one is Conqueror, and Conqueror is pretty good against melees that want extended trades. So an example would be something like Yasuo, Yone, Aurelia. It's kind of required that you take Conqueror in these matchups. You can also take Conqueror against Assassins if you prefer. A lot of the time, I think Phase Rush can be good against Assassins, depending on which one. Like versus Zed, for example, Phase Rush to dodge the Shurikens can be nice. If you're playing against some Assassins, you can take First Strike because they can't pressure you. But there will be also, certain Assassins where you kind of just need to fight them in melee. And then again, Conqueror is quite good for that. So you'll be wanting to take Presence of Mind. And then here you can basically take any of the three, depending on what you need. So Tenacity can be quite good if you kind of need Tenacity, but you want to skip Mercs. Can be a good way to get it. Otherwise, I think Alacrity is just a safe go-to. Bloodline is not too bad either, so you can consider that. And then down here, most of the time it'll be Last Stand, but it can also be cut down. Basically, as long as it's not this one, it should be fine. And then for secondaries, again, you just go for the sorcery page. I would recommend going Absolute Focus, Gathering Storm, but it's possible that you want mana flow, because even though Presence of Mind is quite good for mana in team fights, it's not very good for mana in lane. So you might find something like this to be better, or you might even find that in these matchups you really need Scorch because they can be quite close. So it's kind of up to you. Again, I think if you can get away with it, you should go for this, but it's, yeah, really up to you. The last page is the Electrocute page. So this page here it's pretty cheesy, to be honest, and you should probably pair it with Ignite if you're playing it. And the whole purpose of this build is to Q on your opponent in melee at level 1 and level 2. Dobby has a whole video on this, so you might want to look up Dobby Electrocute Jayce on YouTube after this video if you really care about it. I don't think this page is that good, but there are some matchups where it is good. So basically, you're going to take Sudden Impact, which gives you a lot of damage early game when you Q on someone in melee. And then you're going to take Eyeball and then Movement Speed down here. And we're going to need a strong lane, so we're going to go for Mana Flow and Scourge. And this gives you a ton of pressure in the early game. Like I said, though, this is very reliant on being able to Q onto your opponent without them being able to cancel it or dodge it. So, for example, if you Q onto a Syndra, she can knock you back with E. If you Q onto LeBlanc, she will win the trade because she hits you with Chain. If you Q onto Lux, she again wins the trade because she hits you with Q. So there are certain champions that you don't want to do this against. The best champs to do this against are ones that either don't have a dash or ones that don't have a way to stop you from getting on them. So for example, you could do it against Corki. Even though Corki does have a dash, if you Q onto Corki and he commits W, it's going to be too much mana and he's going to lose the trade anyway. So basically, it's like an ultra strong early game version of the First Strike page in that it's giving you more burst. Personally, I don't really use this. I've used it a couple times. I do think it has potential. At least for me, I don't find that often that I'm in a matchup where I'd even consider taking it. So again, just to recap, most of the time you should be looking to take Phase Rush or First Strike. If you're not sure, just go Phase Rush and you should have no issue. Jayce's itemization actually doesn't change too much. There are some situational items, but for the most part, you can follow a cookie cutter build and it'll be good. For our starting items, we're going to want to go for D-Blade and a health pot in 99% of games. D-Blade is just too much strength in the early game, and after the buffs to Doran's items, there isn't much reason to start with Longsword refillable anymore, so you can basically just default to this. The only time you ever might want to go D-Shield is if you're laning a very tough mage matchup, so again, a Syndra or Ori or something, you can consider D-Shield. You don't actually have to play D-Shield in these matchups, it's more just if you're having a lot of trouble in the lane, D-Shield can help you get through those early levels in reasonable shape. For our early buys, a lot of it will depend on how much gold we recall on. So the best first buy is actually to buy a Dirk. If you can afford buying Dirk, it is actually worth delaying tier 4. That being said, if you don't base on enough gold for Dirk, then you probably just want to buy like tier longsword or tier boots, depending on how early do you need this movement speed or not. But Dirk really is the gold standard, and it's going to change your lane a lot when you get it. If you did just want to prioritize your scaling, you can buy, say, like tier longswords and stuff, even if you have Dirk gold. I would not recommend it, though. I really think delaying tier is the correct choice most of the time. But after your first base, you definitely want to pick up tier. Obviously, if you can buy both on first base, like tier and Dirk, that's great. Game's pretty much over. But yeah, prioritize Dirk. As for the other early buys, the only one really is Refillable. Refillable is a great item in general in the early game. It's very cheap for the amount of HP it gives. And that's very important because you can use that HP to help you survive, or you can use that HP to allow you to trade more aggressively. So either way, it's pretty good. For boot options, there are 4 on Jayce. So your default is going to be Lucidity boots. So CDR boots are pretty good. 1, because they're cheap, and 2, because of the Summoner spell haste. So flash cooldown is pretty valuable on Jayce. TP cooldown also helps a lot with side laning, and the ability haste is pretty good too. So this is, again, going to be your go-to option. Merc Treads are going to be the pickup if you're against a double AP mid jungle, or if the enemy team has a lot of CC. So if you're playing against something like, I don't know, Syndra plus something, you're probably going to want to go Merc Treads. And Merc Treads in general are pretty useful for a lot of different matchups mid. So again, Syndra, Lissandra, Zoe, all of these matchups, you kind of just need Merc Treads. But they can also be useful just if the enemy team has CC. So even if they don't have any CC on their mid, let's say you're laning against something like I don't know, Oriana, you might still consider Mercs if the enemy team has something like a support Leona. You just might want to pick them up a bit later in the game. Steel caps can be good on Jayce. It's worth noting that steel caps are only really worth buying for the passive, not so much for the armor. It's kind of similar to Merc Treads. Like if all you wanted was MR, you should just buy the null magic and sit on it and not actually buy the boots. Same thing with steel caps. If you aren't getting use out of the reducing incoming damage from attacks, not really worth buying. You're better off either buying a cloth armor and sitting on it, or just not buying cloth armor altogether and relying on your melee form resistances. And finally, there are Swifty Boots. So Swifty Boots are really, really good on Jayce. Again, they're very cheap, and movement speed is super nice for Jayce, for chasing people down, for running away, just for kiting in general. So it's super, super nice. And if you ever see like Rylai's users on the enemy team, or people with big slow effects, something like a Zillion, you can just immediately slam a Swifties, and it's going to be really, really useful for you. For our standard Jayce build, obviously you're going to want to grab a tier in the early game. Then you're going to want to pick up your Opportunity and your CDR boots. From there, finish your Mana Moon, buy Seroda's third, and then you really have situational items. In some cases, Seroda's third can be situational, and I'll kind of talk about that down here. But most of the time, going Seroda's third is the safe play, and then your last items can be situational. Edge of Night and Eclipse will generally be the go-to. That's because the Edge of Night gives lethality, which helps with your Seroda's Grudge, and also the spell shield on it is super, super nice. And finally, Eclipse is just a great item in general, so it's really nice to round out the build with this. Finally, I'll talk about the situational items, and the first situational one is Eclipse. And the reason it's situational is because you can actually buy Eclipse first item if you prefer. So rather than playing for a lethality build, you can play a more bruiser-esque build where we'll rush out Eclipse instead of Opportunity, and we probably won't build any lethality later on. We'll build items such as Maw or Shojin or whatever instead, which we'll get to. But basically, Eclipse early can be good if you really value the shield. So maybe if you're in an assassin matchup that you think you're going to die in, or that you're against a tank or something and the lethality just isn't going to be that useful. Overall, I think in mid, Opportunity is better, especially with the Dirk Spike, but there are definitely games where you should be looking to rush out Eclipse instead of a lethality item. Next is Edge of Night. So as I said before, I think Edge of Night fits into most builds, but basically you can drop Edge of Night. Like if you don't think the lethality is going to be valuable, or you want, say, defensive stats, like you could go, say, Seroda's and then buy more instead, you know, like that can be fine. Basically, Edge of Night's a good item, and you should try fit it in the build, but it's one of the most droppable items too. Like if you really needed something else, some other situational item, it can easily take this place. You can even just rush out Eclipse instead of that and pick up Edge of Night later if you want. So feel free to do what you want with that. Ghostblade. So Ghostblade it's good for a couple reasons. One, it can be good as an extra movement speed item in the late game. So for example, ultra late game, you might end up selling your boots, and in that case, you're going to want to either buy Ghostblade or you're going to want to buy Deadman's, because you're going to need the extra movement speed. So when you're finally at those 6 items, you can look to sell like that and get the move speed that way. One other thing you can do is you can go double lethality before you buy Serilda's if you want. So you can go, say, Opportunity, City Albert's Mana Immune, and then another lethality item. Oops, I don't know how that got up there. Another lethality item, such as you could go, say, Ghostblade after this. So Ghostblade, then Serilda. You could go Edge of Night and then Serilda. Basically, that's going to be a bigger spike in the short term, and it's really good against squishy teams. Personally, I kind of stopped doing this, and the reason was that I feel like Serilda's just becomes so useful so quick. And a lot of the time, you'll end up playing against someone in the side lane or whatever who has a lot of armor, and you really want that over the lethality. But it is an option if you want to go 2 lethality items before Serilda. Now we have Shojin. So Shojin is pretty good on Jayce, but it's not as good as it used to be. So the reason it's good is because it makes your basic spells deal a lot of damage. But the ability haste is not as useful as it used to be, because it's pretty much well, it's not impossible, but it's just very unrealistic to reach the breakpoint where you can fire 2 Qs through 1 gate, which used to be possible last split. Pretty hard to do now. So Shojin can still be bought, especially if you're playing a bruiser build. Like if you do go Eclipse, you probably want to prioritize something like Shojin over Edge of Night. But personally, I find that I don't fit Shojin into my builds that much. Maybe if you were playing this build and you didn't need Edge of Night, you could look for something like Shojin instead. But overall, it's definitely more of a situational item. But again, it can be useful for the extra health, and obviously it's just it's a decent item all around. Maw is pretty good. So Maw, if you just need a lot of magic resist, is a really good pickup. Again, this can be bought before Serilda if you need it. So you can go Opportunity, Mana Immune, Maw, Serilda. You can also buy it afterwards. I would say drop Edge of Night for Maw most of the time. Like you probably don't want Edge of Night and Maw, although you can. If you really just need to survive against some like AP and you need the Spell Shield and the MR, I think that's fine. But trying to get Eclipse in your build, I think, is normally better. Next, we have Serpent's Fang. So Serpent's Fang is not something that I buy very often, but again, it can be nice for the double lethality. before you pick up your Cyrilda. So if you're against, I don't know, something like a Cog Lulu, where you know there's going to be a lot of shields, it can be a good idea to go Opportunity Manamune and pick up your Serpent's Fang before going Cyrilda, but honestly, I don't buy this a whole lot. Hubris is another item that you can consider as your first item, so instead of Opportunity, you could go for Hubris. I don't really like it. I think that it takes a while to be useful, and I really value the movement speed and bonus lethality that you get from Opportunity. Also, it's cheaper, but it is something you can consider if you really think you're going to get Ultra Fed. And finally, as I said before, Deadman's can kind of be a pickup where you want to sell your boots late game, and it can be a good way to get both some armor and some movement speed. For summoners on Jayce, in 90% of your games, you're going to want to run Flash TP. If you're not sure how to get a lot of use out of TP, I do have a guide on my channel on how to use it. Otherwise, if you're not taking Flash TP, it's because you're going to be taking that Electrocute setup with Ignite, and again, you do that in matchups where you know you can snowball. Other than that, there really isn't any other sum worth taking. You never need defensive summoners like Exhaust or Barrier, Heal, or anything on Jayce because you're very tanky anyway in your melee form, so you just don't really need them. And Ghost isn't super valuable on the champ. You already have a ton of movement speed. And overall, Teleport just allows you to pressure mid lane the most. It's also quite useful in the mid game for allowing you to just keep playing the side lane, you know, farm camps, push the waves, and be able to group with your team if they start a fight. Now I'm just going to go through the Jayce abilities one by one and explain them to you. So first off is the passive. Basically, Jayce can swap between two different forms, which are ranged and melee, by pressing your R. So this is in place of having a regular ultimate ability. And what this does is when you swap, it changes your orders from melee to ranged or ranged to melee and grants you access to 3 new abilities that you wouldn't have in your other form. Now we'll start with the ranged form. So your first ability, Shock Blast, this is a line skill shot that moves relatively slowly. It's small AoE splash damage as well. But the most important thing on this is firing this orb through an acceleration gate increases the range, speed, and raises the damage. So that's your E, which we'll get to. But basically, that's going to be the basis of a lot of your combos. Next, we have your W. So W increases your attack speed, and it's also an auto attack reset. So for example, while you can press W and get an instant 3 auto attacks off, you can also quickly auto and then immediately press W and you can get 4 auto attacks like that. So that's a nice little tip for you. I'll probably bring that up again in the combo section just in case you forget. And next ability we have is the E. So this is the one that Jayce is kind of known for, this QE combo. So this acceleration gate is kind of a weird skill shot, but it is a skill shot, I suppose. You place it, basically, and when you move through it, you or any ally gains movement speed, and it increases the speed of your Q and its damage. So as you can see, if you place a Q, even if it goes through it at the very end, it will speed it up towards the end. Obviously, if you place it kind of close to yourself, then it gets sped up nice and early. So those are the range form abilities. Let's swap over to melee and see what these do. So first off, the melee Q, you leap to an enemy, which is a dash, and slow surrounding enemies for 2 seconds. So there's a couple things with this. One, this can be used to dash over walls and stuff. For example, you can Q over this wall and it'll hit them. Also, it can be quite useful, and I'll talk about this more in the combo section, but sometimes you can like Q to creeps in order to slow someone. So imagine like the creep wave is right here. Even if your opponent is slightly behind, you might be able to Q here and still get the slow onto them, which can be a good way to initiate a trade. Next, we have the W. So the W has 2 parts to it. First off, the hammer auto attacks, if you have W skilled, grant mana. So this can be kind of useful early on in the lane where you don't have a whole lot of mana. If you use all your abilities in range form, you might as well like swap to melee form and try and get some mana back. Your W active, basically you just create this like AoE damaging effect that deals damage to targets. To be honest, this is probably Jayce's weakest ability, but it is still kind of nice for helping you push the wave, and also just adds up to a little bit of damage in fights. And importantly, it does magic damage as well, which means that even though Jayce is, you know, primarily AD, it allows you to do a little bit of magic damage to people that are still stacking a lot of MR. Next, we have the E, and the way this works is you just knock back the target, and you also deal some max HP magic damage to them, which is pretty nice. So this can be used mainly as disengage. It can also be used in trades and stuff to end it, you know, to add a lot of damage to the end of the trade. I believe you can knock people over walls if you have the angle right, so this could be good or bad. It can be good because it can allow you to dash over the wall. You know, it can give you an escape in that sense. It can also be bad because maybe you need to chase them down and you don't have any abilities up and you E them to safety. So that's kind of how each ability works. There are a couple more things you need to know about abilities, and the first is that whenever you swap forms, you gain a little bit of movement speed. So if you just pay attention to this down here, you'll see that I get a little bit of movement speed every time I swap. And this is quite useful because it'll be good for either running away from people, it can be good for initiating trades, it can be good for dodging skill shots and stuff like that. So definitely don't neglect that. Obviously, it costs no mana to swap, although there is a short timer before you can swap again, but that is definitely worth thinking about. Also, the first attack in each form has a different effect. So your first attack in ranged form shreds the enemy resistances for a short amount of time. So if you see, if I order them, I get a little bit of resistance shred. That's what this is. And the first auto attack in your melee form just does bonus magic damage. So it's not a huge thing to play around. It's more like it's just going to fit into your combo kind of naturally. The main thing to be aware of it really is that if you are swapping and you're looking to try all in, it's very important that you don't use this first auto attack on a creep, because if you are trying to auto attack and you quickly auto a CS before you look for the all in, then you're going to be lacking a lot of additional damage. For Jayce's ability max order, you're going to want to max Q, then W, then E. You don't actually put any points in ult in this champ. You start with 1 in it, and you can't put any more on it. So that means each Jayce ability has 6 skill points rather than 5. So again, just max Q, then W, then E. The only other thing you really need to know is that in the early game, you'll almost always start Q, skill E level 2, then Q level 3, then finally W level 4. And the reason for that is that QE, this combo here, doesn't really do much damage, or at least it's not really worth casting in terms of mana to damage until you have 2 points in Q. That being said, you can be stronger at level 2 by going QW. So if you go QW, you know, having the empowered or having more auto attacks is generally stronger, but it's going to mean that you won't have your E until level 3 and then your second point in Q until level 4. So basically, most of the time you want to go QE, QW, but if you really want a level 2 spike, you can go like QW and then probably still QE, or you can go E as well, kind of depends. I would just recommend going QE, QW for your first 4 levels. Let's start off our combo section by talking about their QE. So this is by far the most important combo on Jayce and the one that you're going to use the most. Pretty easy to execute. What you want to do is Q your target and then E as close as possible to yourself. So you can do a QE like this. You can get it a lot closer than this. Like you can pretty much press it on your body and it's still going to go up. That might be ping dependent. I'm not 100% sure. But as long as you can get the E like relatively close to yourself, it doesn't have to be exactly on you. It's still going to be good. And this is your most basic laning combo. You're just going to poke your opponent with QE from range. You can splash it off creeps, or you can try, you know, weave it through the wave. You'll see lots of examples of this in the laning section. But yeah, just be aware of that. If you need to practice it in practice tool, come do so, but it shouldn't take you too long to get. The second most basic combo, and one that you're going to use against a lot of melees, is just by starting a trade in melee form, even if you don't have any range cooldowns, and just going for a Q, W auto, and then Eing them away and running. So basically, you come up to them, you press Q, W, you get the auto off, and then you'll E them and run away with your phase rush movement speed. So obviously, we can do that a lot faster. Imagine we're running up to our opponent, just go for a quick, you know, trade like this, get all our abilities off, and then run away. So this can be quite useful if you don't have any cooldowns up in your other form anyway, and your opponent like walks too far up. Again, especially good against melee champions. Now, the next 2 trades are ones that we're going to look for. They're not really all-ins per se, but it is like how you're going to start all-ins. So it's just, are you going to start the trade with range form or melee form? And we'll talk about those. So if you want to start like a really heavy trade with melee form, what you want to do is you want to QE, press W, and then immediately swap to melee. One thing I haven't talked about is that your W, the attack speed actually carries over to your melee form. So if you W in range and then swap to melee, these auto attacks are all empowered or all have increased attack speed from your ranged form. So what you're going to want to do in order to start this trade is you're going to want to QE like this. So let's say that you QE, W, and then you're going to use this movement speed from your gate to Q onto your opponent and try get those empowered orders off. I did it a bit too slow because I was trying to show you, but let's refresh my commands and do it again. So just press QE, W, immediately swap melee, QW, get all your orders off, and then you can E them at the very end. And then you can use your phase rush movement speed again to disengage. So this combo is going to be used if you feel comfortable committing to your opponent. So like if your opponent doesn't have a way to disengage you, like they don't have RE charm up, or they don't have, say, Syndra E or something like that, then it's very easy for you to swap to melee and go for the full trade. If they do have one of those things up, you probably just want to, you know, sit with this and not actually engage. You can use the movement speed to try bait the cooldown out maybe, but you probably don't want to actually engage onto. You can also look to start your heavy trade or all-in melee form. So you might find that if your opponent overextends too far in the lane, that you can look to either Q on them directly or Q on a creep in front of them. So this combo is a little harder to pull off, but it's still pretty much just using all your abilities. It's just there is some nuance to it. So what you're going to want to do is, again, either Q on them, or more likely, you'll just Q on the creep in front of them in order to slow them. And I'll do this combo slowly the first time just to show you. So you Q on them, press W, go for the auto E, and then swap into range form, go for one auto attack, then you use your W as an auto reset, and finally QE them at the end. So that's how you can kind of like maximize your damage. There is one more mechanic we can actually fit in there, but it's a bit advanced. We'll get to it in a little bit. But pretty much, if I just show you guys how to do this a little bit quicker, you'll start them again in the melee form. You're going to quickly Q on them, go for this, hit them away, go for one auto, kite with your auto attacks, and then QE them at the end. So I don't know how much sense what I just said made, but you can kind of see there. It's pretty much just you are using all your abilities. The only real difficult things is making sure you get off that auto before you use your W for the auto reset. It's not 100% crucial. Like, if you don't get that auto off, it's not the end of the world, but at the end of the day, like, every little bit of damage adds up. So if you can, you should try. If you can, it's also important to try kite in between your autos. So rather than just standing still and going for 4 auto attacks like this, if you can move a little bit, sometimes you'll be able to chase your opponent down when you otherwise wouldn't be able to. So again, just start that normal auto and then kind of move in between every auto like that. So if you can execute on the combos that I've showed you so far, you should pretty much be good to go, but there are some extra advanced mechanics that I'd like to show you. The first one is the Q flash, so you can press Q before flashing, which can make it harder for your opponent to react to. You can also go for a QE flash, where you just essentially do the same thing, except you cast E on yourself pretty much as soon as you come out of the flash. Again, it makes it a little harder to react to, but a lot of the time you don't actually need to do this. I guess the time to do it might be if you're worried your opponent is going to flash it and you want to make it as hard as possible for them to react to it. Another thing you can do is you can actually buffer your melee Q with flash. So basically, the way targeted abilities work in this game is if you Q on the opponent, it's going to walk to it and then it'll cast it the moment it's in range. So if you want your Q to go off even quicker, what you can do is have them, press the Q so that you're moving into them and then immediately flash, and it will go off pretty much straight away. So that makes it, I guess, the, again, least amount of time they have to react to it, but they can flash it in time if they're quick. Another advanced mechanic that's actually really useful is that you can fit in an auto attack after you E your opponent. So the way to do this is pretty much just to spam right click or spam A or whatever you're going to use for auto attack on your opponent, and you can quickly get that auto off, and that can add a little bit of extra damage to some of those combos. So if you see here, again, E, just immediately right click or A, and you should be able to get an auto off. This, I think, does depend a little bit maybe on the range that you do it from. Like, I think if you do a max range E, you're not quite in auto range, but if you are close to them, it should be fairly replicable, I feel like if I'm right next to them. Yeah, so I think it is a little dependent on distance, and you might find this a little harder to do in game, obviously, because you'll be thinking about a lot of other stuff. But if you come into practice tool and try it out, you should get a good feel for it. And like I said, it's actually not too hard to do, although a little dependent on your distance. Another mechanic is that if you get 100 ability haste and a Spear of Shojin, you can actually fire 2 Qs through every gate. So if you see here, this cooldown will come up in time just barely to fire a second empowered Q through it. The problem is, compared to last season, this build isn't really realistic anymore, and it requires you kind of going out of your way to get a bit more CDR, and the problem is that CDR isn't really useful until you reach that breakpoint. So for example, you could take Transcendence on your champ to reach this a little easier, but then for most of the game, we're giving up Absolute Focus, which is going to be better. And again, we could take something like a CDR shard here, but is it really worth it for the ultra late game power spike? I would say probably not. And again, you do need the Shojin, not just 100 ability haste, because this also gives your non-ultimate spells ability haste. So for example, if I sold this and bought, like, I don't know, Zeke's, again, I still have 100 ability haste, but now I won't actually be able to get to off in time. If I just spam this, I'm 99% sure. Yeah, so can't quite get it off in time. You do require 100 ability haste and a Shojin. As such, it's not really realistic these days. But perhaps if you end up with extra CDR from blue buff, or I don't know, you just build in a sort of interesting way, maybe ultra late game you can look for it, so just keep an eye on it. And lastly, I'll just share with you guys some of the tips I have. So the first one is that QE does give vision of bushes. So if, for example, you want to QE this bush, you will see that there's a target in there, and this can be quite useful for face checking in the mid game. I believe you can do this with just Q as well. It doesn't actually have to be E'd, but obviously you got more range with QE, so you might be unsafe actually walking up to this with the regular Q. It's also really important that you don't forget about the fact that your melee R gives resistances. So if you take a look at my resist down here, when I press R, you actually get a fair amount of tank here. And this is really, really useful because if you know you're going to take damage from, say, like a Z ult or a Fizz ult or something, it's very, very important that you're in melee form for this because it adds a lot of additional tankiness. So that's extremely, extremely important for assassin matchups and even for some kind of AP mage burst matchups. Your phase rush usage is also incredibly important, and I'll show you some examples of this in the laning phase, but sometimes just using that phase rush to dodge their first skill shot is actually more valuable than going for essentially the max damage combo. So what you might want to do, let's say this is like an Ahri holding Charm or a Lux holding Q or something like that, immediately proc phase rush onto the guy, or basically by queuing onto the creep and then hitting your AoE W on them, and then pretty much just use your phase rush to dodge. So for example, you could do something like this and then immediately run up rather than going initially onto our opponent. Because if we can dodge this first Q or this, Lux Q, Ahri Charm, Syndra E, whatever, we should have a really easy time running them down the lane after that. So really, it's just that you QE, swap melee, and then you're going to proc phase rush with obviously your Q, your range Q, and your melee Q, and then your melee W hitting them as well. So just one more time, because it is really, really important that you guys get good at this. Let me just wait for this to come back up. Again, just QE onto your opponent, immediately swap, press all your buttons pretty much, and then just run past them. So again, go to the laning section and I'll show you some examples. Finally, don't forget that you can E people before queuing them and get a little more distance if you're trying to run away. So for example, let's say that your enemy mid is here and you're getting ganked by the enemy jungler here. Rather than immediately queuing to this guy, you might want to E them away for more distance and then queue after them, and then you can phase rush away. That gets you a slight little bit more distance. It can also be used, I guess, for pushing people over walls and jumping to it. Like if we need to get over this wall, or maybe this is like a Jarvan ult or something, you can E your opponent out of it and then use them pretty much as an escape. So again, a bit more niche, but something you should at least keep in mind. I'm going to go over 3 mid matchups, and the first one here is Jayce versus Ahri. So this is a slightly Ahri favored matchup, and the reason is that she's a little bit stronger than you early, and also because she can save her E for when you jump on her in melee form. If she hits that, she's generally going to win. So your main objective as Jayce in the pre-6 is to abuse the fact that you have 80 auto attacks to get push on the wave. Now, you're not actually that strong in trading until level 3. If your opponent walks up and uses a cooldown, you can look to Q on them in melee. But as you can see, the trade's not even that good for me, and it does use a lot of mana. So generally as Jayce, your goal is just to build a maybe small CS lead early game, but really you're just trying to get to your Dirk if you can. Like you spike incredibly hard on Dirk. 2 will get Prow in most matchups just because you have 80 auto attacks and your opponent doesn't, so that allows you to push quicker, but you're not really expecting to win the game as per se in this stage of the game, right? Level 2, you can look for maybe 1 QE if you want, but it's very costly on mana and it doesn't do a whole lot of damage. So I would limit yourself to just 1 and don't do more than that. Again, it helps you secure push, which is going to put you in control, but you're not really expecting to get big trades at this stage of the game. But you can see, because of my auto attacks and stuff, I was able to get push, and so we just go for a 3-wave crash, slowly pushing them in. Now, once you get level 3, your QE actually does start to hurt quite a bit, so if your opponent stacks too close to the wave, you can look to QE them. Just be careful, again, how much mana you use early game. You'll be able to get a bit of mana back once you get level 4 and you get your melee W. And now here, I would have kept going, but I actually roamed and ended up killing Camille, so that changed things a little bit, and then I ended up losing a lot of HP here. But this doesn't really matter too much. Like I said, those first 3 levels, you're just trying to, get control, abuse your level 2, level 3 advantage, etc. And now we'll go to the post-burst base. So normally, you'll be recalling with just a Dirk. Now here I managed to get Dirk and Tyr because I got that first blood, but ultimately, I based with the same amount of combat power as I normally would, because I'd be placing with this Dirk. In fact, I might even be slightly, not behind, but Ahri got to force me to base first because I lost a little bit of HP in that trade, or in that fight that we had. Whereas normally you should probably force Ahri to recall first, if you're playing better than her anyway. But now that we've got the Dirk, we definitely want to look to force trades. So there's a couple ways we can do this. The first is you can push the wave and then come kind of hide in fog while they clear the waves. This is especially good if you pink the bush, but then you can come just sit here, and when they're clearing under tower, you can look for a quick little bit of poke. So you can see I come here and drop the ward, and I know that this is free poke onto Ahri. So this is a very good way to get some kind of cheap trades. No idea why this just opened. Anyway, so yeah, just going to keep pushing at this point. And if our opponent uses too many cooldowns, we can look to go on them, but we want to at least poke them down with QE a little bit before we do that. So you can see here, again, if she walks too close to wave, I will try splash her with QE. But if she respects cleanly, then it's going to be a little harder for me to punish, and I'm kind of afraid to go melee here. Now, here I go for the QE. I was thinking that I could hit her on the edge here and actually splash her, but it turns out it misses. Now, one thing you want to do even if you miss, is you want to normally press W and swap melee. And the reason is that you're not going to be that pressuring in your range form anyway, so you might as well pressure with your melee form cooldowns. So here what I do is I swap melee, and I instantly try and use the movement speed, both from my form swap and from my gate, in order to dodge this charm. And if you can dodge the charm, you'll guarantee win the trade. So you can see here, despite missing the QE, which is a huge chunk of my damage, I just have so much movement speed, I'm able to get onto her, and then I actually get her ulti out for free, which is, really, really big deal in this sort of matchup. So we're very, very far ahead now. She's forced to reset. I throw some QEs at her under tower, but unfortunately I missed. But either way, she's forced to reset, and we're in a good spot again. So we come back to lane. We've got some items. I try and set up some vision for myself so that I can look to poke her down. Jayce is not the best roamer. If people get low and stuff, you can look to roam to their lanes, but generally you're not looking to roam. You are just looking to kind of hit your one item spike and harass your opponent under tower as much as you can. Yeah, Ahri tries to all in me, but she doesn't really think about my resistances, I guess. Like, I think I only took a little bit of damage in melee there, but I was just a lot tankier than she expected. Not too much to see here. The last trade I want to quickly show you guys. So I QE her immediately, and then I use the movement speed from my E and from my form swap to chase her, and then I Q to a melee creep in order to get the slow on her. And that ends up being a very good trade for me. So as you can see, even a matchup that is slightly favored against me, I was able to end up coming out on top, and Jayce scales incredibly well. Definitely outscales Ahri, particularly if you're ahead. So this is a really, really good spot to be in. So let's move on to a different matchup. Our second matchup is Jayce versus Syndra, which is a pretty difficult mid matchup. Now, I did notice that Syndra went for first strike, which means I can go for D-Blade instead of D-Shield. I think if you're playing against Comet or Airy Syndra, you probably should go D-Shield in this matchup. But anyway, I was able to get away with D-Blade. And like I said, this is a difficult matchup because it is hard to Q onto your opponent because they can just hold their E the whole lane and then poke you with Q. And as long as they position correctly in order to not get poked on the creep wave, they should be fine. That being said, sometimes you can cheese priority in this matchup early. So you can see I walked up to the wave at level 1. That meant that I got several auto attacks on the wave before she even got her first one. And again, because I have AD auto attacks and she only has a well, I guess she has AD autos too, but you know what I mean. Her auto attacks deal less damage than mine do, so I'm able to get pushed. And I guess your objective in a matchup like this is really just to neutralize pre-Dirk. Like if you can get some sort of lead, you want to, but you're not really expecting to. So overall, I was able to get prior, which means I can get, again, level 2 advantage and 3 advantage. In a matchup like this, though, that's more so I don't get punished rather than I can punish myself. If your opponent does use her E aggressively like that, or, Lux Q, Ahri Charm, whatever, potentially you have a window to look for a trade. It's a bit too early in the lane for me to look, so I wasn't able to. But if the opponent's further away from tower, and again, a bit later in the lane, you probably can look for that. So most of this lane is just spent neutralizing. You can see that once I get my 2 points in Q, now I'm actually starting to look for QEs if she does stand too close to the creep wave. So you can see here, I found a window to get a little bit of damage on her. It actually is pretty good. And I could go melee form here, and I almost did. Again, the reason I was kind of hesitant to is because she still has her E, and I know if I get hit by the E, it's probably going to be a losing trade. I tried to use the movement speed to bait out some cooldowns. Unfortunately, did not work. And I almost swapped melee to punish there at the end, but I decided I wasn't going to be able to get it off in time. But anyway, that's why this is a bad matchup, right? So we continue to do the same thing, just poking with QE. It really isn't anything special here. I think here I managed to get one QE past the wave. So when there's only one set of creeps... Oh, actually, it wasn't past the wave. I was going to say, when there's only one set of creeps in the lane, sometimes you can just walk past it and look for a trade. Here I was able to Q onto her because I had my jungler around. I actually got her flash. I definitely would not have done that in the 1v1. But you can see I'm forced to reset and I pick up my Dirk. Now, if I wanted to play ultra safe, I could probably go Merc Treads here. I think I decided that because she had first strike that I actually didn't need to. But potentially, if you're falling behind or if she's bullying you really hard, you might want to buy Merc Treads here instead. But that's definitely like as a neutralizer rather than like a snowballing tool. Like you can definitely win lane with Merc Treads, but you're going to win lane a lot harder with Dirk. So I looked for a trade here. Unfortunately, did not hit it. But anyway, she TP's back. And we go back to kind of laning like normal. Syndra at level 6 is pretty strong, but without Dirk Spike, any like poke we get is actually going to hurt, pretty hard. So our main goal at this point is to try and either bait out her stun, or if she wastes her stun, to try punish while it's down. Again, in a difficult matchup like this, not really expecting a whole lot. And if you're playing against like Syndra and Orion or Victor or Lux or, Xerath, anything like that, you're generally not... You're either going to be even or slightly behind, but you counter these champs really hard in team fights because you will outrange them, and they don't have any life steals. So any poke that you land is going to stick really hard. And if you can land even one QE on a Syndra before a team fight, it's going to make her team fight way, way more difficult. So even though these are lane counters, Syndra's actually very, very good against Jayce in lane. Outside the lane, it's actually not too bad. In fact, it might even be Jayce's favorite outside the lane. So again, trying to use some of our Q or our ulti movement speed in order to dodge more skill shots. I think here I end up getting a... I'm not actually sure what happened here. I guess she walked... Oh, that's right. Okay, so there was some jungle shenanigans. This doesn't really matter. It ends up being I get 2 assists, the Warwick gets a kill. But there is some interesting stuff I'd like to show you now. So coming back to the lane, yeah, Syndra used her stun, so I know that I can make her walk the long way, because if she comes this way, I'm going to look to force trade on her. Again, I use my priority, or rather, I use my first access to the wave to get priority, and then I just come and hide in fog, and I look for a little bit of poke on her while she's under tower. So as long as you stay out of vision here, you might be able to find some poke here, or you might not. I was able to come up here and get some honey fruit. Now, coming back to mid here, I believe I got a little bit of a trade on... Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I come back mid, and Karthus is on the red, so Warwick's able to look for a gank on me. Just play this out. Okay, yeah, so Warwick's below me. I look for a quick trade on Syndra. I do try and use my movement speed to dodge the stun, but I wasn't quite able to do it. But at least I didn't get stunned, but I still got knocked back, which is better than nothing. And yeah, so at that point, I was able to continue the trade, so you can kind of... I'll just play it one more time. So I would have been happy with just this QE trade, but if you feel like you can use your movement speed for more, like, again, try and dodge it. And you can see I actually dodged a lot of her damage there. I dodged her Q with my Q as well. So it ended up being an extremely, extremely good trade. She goes for a reset, so do I. And I'll show you just one more thing. So again, laning like normal. She walks... I'm very strong at this point because I have my opportunity, right? Like I have a completed item. She walks a little bit too far up on this wave. I immediately QE her. And then I dodged the stun with my movement speed and flashed her for a kill because I knew she had no flash. So again, this is a really difficult matchup and you're not really expecting to get a lead. But the ways you might get a lead is if you can find consistent QE poke, whether that's splashing off the wave or under tower or whatever, or if they either waste cooldowns and then you can melee Q either onto them or a creep next to them and look for the trade. Or alternatively, if you can just use all that movement speed from your E and your R in order to just dodge the skill shot in the first place, you can generally come out on top of that. Lastly, I want to show you guys a melee lane, and this is a VOD I had from last season, actually, but I think it's a really good example. So in most melee lanes, you actually want to stay in range form most of the time, unless you want to go for a quick trade and then disengage. And the reason you want to stay in range form is just so you can, again, poke your opponent down with autos, and because you don't really want to get too close to them, right? Like, you don't want to let them chase you down the lane. You just want to keep bullying them with your autos. If you're going to go for a quick trade, again, swapping to melee is fine. But you can see just going for this little, auto poke whenever I can on Akali is generally the play. As with the range matchups, you should try to get priority in the first 3 waves. And what that'll mean is you can either heavily harass your opponent under the tower, or potentially you can use your priority for an invade or something. In this case, I was pretty happy to just harass Akali in the 1v1. Important to note, I guess, is that most melee lanes have very important cooldowns, but while they're down, they're relatively useless. So like Akali, for example, if you respect her Shroud, outside of that, she doesn't really have a whole lot of threat in the early game. So once I knew that the Shroud was down, I didn't really have anything to fear, and I just want to get this wave a bit closer under her tower, and that way I can go for either QE harass under the tower, or I can just look for auto attacks. In this game in particular, I did end up roaming to this invade. I grab a kill, but ultimately doesn't really make a huge difference. So I'll just skim through this because there's not too much at this stage of the game. Okay, so this is where we're kind of back to where we would be. So again, we recall, we get our Dirk on the first base if we can. If we can't, again, you can just buy like tier longsword and stuff like that, and it's normally fine. But if you can get the Dirk, you're in a very good spot. Now, generally, most assassins have a pretty hard time standing up to you, right? Like, because you just have, especially once you get Dirk, you generally just have more damage. So if you hit a QE on someone, as long as they can't chase you down the lane, feel free to go melee for them. So I probably wouldn't do this trade if the wave was, say, up here, because I knew Akali could chase me down the lane. Same if it's like a Yone or a Yasuo or whatever. If they have space to run you down, be careful going melee. But if the wave is close to you, there's not really anything to be scared of. You can see, even though she's close to 6, I go for the trade and I can just eat her away, disengage, and she can't really run me down because there's no space for her to work with. So that's the most important thing against ranged or melee champs. And that's not just a Jayce thing, that's just a countering melee champs as a ranged champ in general. So again, like when this wave goes out, be very careful. That's the window Akali can look to all in if you're a bit low. Now here I was able to get honey fruit, so it shouldn't really matter. I could melee form onto this guy potentially, but I think it's safer just to stay in range. And again, whenever she comes up for creeps, I can potentially look. Remember to respect when she's in the shroud though. I think I can look for a trade here maybe. Splits crosses. But pretty much just same thing from here on out. Just poking whenever I can. And then like if the wave is close to me, I feel comfortable going melee. If you have phase rush, like in this game I had first strike, if you have phase rush, you can go melee a bit further up in the lane, knowing that like, okay, well you can get away a little bit easier than other lanes. Especially, you know, there will also be some champs where you're capable of just fighting them, right? Like if you take Conqueror and you're against Yone, like it's fine to trade as long as you're not like super far up in the lane, right? Like if they have a ton of distance to run you down with lethal tempo, it can be bad. But it's okay to go for like sort of extended trades. Just remember that like eventually you do run out of steam and you will have to kind of back away. So make sure you have that safety. So overall, most of Jayce laning comes down to abusing the fact that even though you're weak pre-Dirk, you still have some advantages with your AD auto attacks, and just because you have two sets of cooldowns, which makes it quite hard for your opponent to push you off the wave, but it's still quite easy for you to push them off the wave. So keep that in mind. And then once you get Dirk, you're really looking to force trades either by getting poked from Fog of War, potentially melee queuing the range creeps or the melee creeps if your opponent steps up too far. Remember to use the movement speed from your gate and ult to dodge abilities, and other than that, just QE your opponent when they're out of position. Let's go through a few Jayce team fighting examples. And for Jayce, there's really only two big things to focus on. And the first is to try find as much QE poke before the start of the fight, so hide in fog, or just, you know, catch people off guard, you know, poke people from over walls, whatever you need to do to hit QE poke before the fight starts. A lot of the time, you can win the fight before it even begins. The second thing is to choose the right moment to go melee. So you kind of need to wait for people to use cooldowns or for people to get a bit lower before you commit into the fight, especially if you're playing without phase rush. So this fight here, it ends up being pretty long, but at the start, okay, I have a flank. I managed to find some nice poke and illusion. You can see I'm sort of fishing to get a bit closer. I do end up swapping melee, but I decide that actually I'm not ready to go in because Rakan still has too much. So I just disengage away. And the thing is with Jayce is that despite being like a poke first champ, he still does a lot of sustained DPS. So you shouldn't be dying for free. You know, it's not like you can go in, drop your combo, and then you're going to win the team fight as a result. You really do need to stay alive. Now here they start Baron. Again, I go for QE poke. And then I want to swap into melee, right? Because I don't have any range cooldowns anyway. But you can see I'm thinking of queuing in, but I decide not to. I queue on the Rakan outside the pit, but I was not going to queue on the Rakan inside the pit because he still had his cooldowns. If I dash in, I instantly die. So instead, I play my range, and we're able to kill everyone here eventually. Now, coming back on the map, pretty much the same thing happens a little bit later. So again, I come mid. I get some nice QE poke to start the fight, which is pretty good. And you can see I'm running in melee, but then I decide to back away, right? And that's again because once I see this Galio ult come out, it's not actually safe to chase. And especially without phase rush, it's really not safe to just chase onto Lucian right now. So I back away. I then go and play my range. And then I can just wait a little bit for some of the cooldowns to be down, and then I can look to re-engage with melee if I want. So you can see here, they're all in the Kindred ult. I believe I poked them with ranged first, and then now there's no cooldowns left, so I'm free to jump back in. So that transition between being ranged and melee is very, very important, and honestly just takes some practice. But the main things you're thinking about is like, okay, well, what cooldowns are available? So the specific ones that I need to be careful of are like Galio W, Galio ult, Rakan W. Those are really the ones I was thinking of. Maybe Gragas E as well if he's in the fight. But Gragas wasn't in a lot of the fights because obviously he was matching Fiora. So yeah, that's kind of a very basic example of what team fighting should look like. And let's move to another one. This example here is of a skirmish that starts somewhat unexpectedly. So one where I wasn't able to set up before the fight. I wasn't able to hit any QEs, but I was just able to use my abilities pretty well in order to get out. So pretty much I'm pushing the side lane maybe a bit greedily because my jungler is topside, and the enemy team ends up showing up. So immediately use our move speed to try get away, flash the first Gwen ult, dodge the center thing, and then dodge the Gwen R with my Q here, and then immediately proc phase rush. So proccing the phase rush thing is very, very important here. If you don't have phase rush, you're probably just dead here, to be honest. But by dodging everything, proccing phase rush, I can run away, then use my E for movement speed and take advantage of it to Q at the same time. So this is a good start of the fight. I've baited out a lot of cooldowns, and I haven't really lost too much for it. So now I look back at these guys. I don't have my range form E up, but I do have a regular Q that I can use. So I try and use this Q before I swap to melee. So I just go for the regular orders in Q and then swap onto melee onto it. So sometimes it can be worth staying in range a little bit longer just to use up all the cooldowns before you swap to melee, even if you don't have that gate. To be honest though, if I'd swapped melee earlier, I don't think it would have made a difference. it was pretty overkill anyway. But that's a good example, I guess, of how to get the maximum usage out of all your abilities in a team fight. The last team fight example I want to show you is one where I have to play slow and play for multiple QE rotations. So this can be good if you're trying to defend an objective, or if you're, holding an area before dragon or whatever. So here, first QE unfortunately gets absorbed by all the shields, and I know that they want to do Baron because our jungler's dead. So my main goal here is to try land poke onto relevant targets. Like if you land poke on the tanks here, especially ones that have sustain, it's kind of pointless. If you land poke onto someone like Ezreal, who does not yet have a lifesteal item, all he has is Bloodline, I believe, it's not very easy for him to heal back up, even with a Sona. So I land one set of poke onto him, use a regular Q because I have no gate anyway, and then I land another QE onto Ezreal. And this making it pretty much impossible for him to teamfight, and then I'm just using my movement speed to threaten over and over here. So you can see that what I do is I swap into melee, and then I actually go back into my gate to get the movement speed again. I'm just trying to threaten on the side. If I can't find an angle, then I won't go, right? But here, I eventually look for something because Ezreal ends up getting Lux ulted, so he had to run away. And I don't think we were actually able to kill many people on the way out. I think we only ended up killing the Ezreal, but this could have been a very disastrous fight. If I'd committed any earlier here, we probably would have died. And if you're more fed here, you can probably stop this by yourself. And there will be a lot of fights as Jayce where you just win them before the fight begins, right? Because like normally, if you chunk Ezreal down that low, it's going to be too hard for him to contest a fight because he just dies to pretty much anything. So if you can get yourself set up before dragons and find multiple QE rotations, like make sure you're in position early, a lot of the time you can just swing the game that way. But, even once it gets to a fight, make sure you, play in your range for as long as you need to, pretty much. And then when you find the right moment, that's when you can go melee. At long last, we arrive at our Jayce matchups. So for me, I don't actually think there is any matchup that is like very, very hard. I think that every matchup at least has some way to win it, whether that's through runes or animizations or just through better gameplay. That being said, depending on like the skill set you have, like if you're weak in certain areas or I don't know, maybe you itemize badly in the matchups, you might find some matchups to be very, very difficult. For example, if you don't know how to play against Aurelia, that one could be insanely difficult. Syndra, if you're not good at dodging skill shots, you don't rush out Merc Treads, if you're against a heavy ganking jungler, that could definitely be very hard as well. Or if you're against an extremely good Orianna playing with Comet, that could be very hard too. So there are some matchups you can maybe make arguments for, but I think they're all playable. Generally, the most difficult matchups for Jayce are ones that are very strong in the early game or have ways to stop you from going melee onto them. So again, like, Cinder Stun can disengage you, Hui EQ, Victor can drop W. Sometimes you can phase rush out of it in time though. Nico's a very good lane bully. Lux again can hold her Q for you. But I think all these matchups, once you get in the mid game, are actually fine. In fact, you might even beat them in the mid game. So even if you lose early, that's normally okay. Skill matchups will mainly be dependent on, what jungler is around you and support and stuff like that. So like LeBlanc, for example, I think you can beat LeBlanc pure 1v1, but her gang setup is extremely good. And also, if you ever Q onto her, she does kind of get a guaranteed chain, so you have to be very, very careful with the times you Q on. Azir is a very strong lane bully. Again, has great gang setup, but you counter him super hard in the mid game, so like that can be, a sort of thing. And then, champs like Ahri tend to beat you pre-Dirk, have great gang setup, but pure 1v1 will probably lose after you get Dirk. Coming down to the easy matchups, generally, assassins are quite easy because of all your resistances and the ability to build Eclipse. Some of these matchups can be a lot harder, again, with the ganking jungler. Like, for example, Yasuo plus Gragas or Yasuo plus Diana is very scary. Same with, like, Lissandra plus Rek'Sai or Jarvan, Ryze plus Lee Sin. But in the 1v1, generally, these matchups aren't too bad. And finally, in the very easy tier, I mean, all these champions don't really have the ability to pressure lane, so you're going to get through that kind of pre-Dirk area extremely easily. In fact, you'll probably have a lead, and then you're just gonna absolutely roll them in the kind of later stages of the lane when you've got Dirk, when you've got Tyr. Some of these champs, again, gank setup wise, can be difficult to deal with. Something like a TF with a ganking jungler, and maybe like Seraphine, like scaling with her shields and stuff. But overall, like you can normally be pretty greedy against these champs. You can take first strike and just look to scale. I will quickly say that I haven't really looked to order the champs within the tiers. I've just ordered them into tiers themselves. But overall, like if you approach every matchup kind of like the correct way, you should come out on top. I will also say that on Mobifier, I have a Jayce guide that has like a little description for each matchup, so you might find checking that out useful as well, and I'll put a link to that in the description. So guys, that's going to be it for my Jayce guide. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below. Otherwise, if you want to see some more Jayce content, come to my stream at twitch.tv/ShokLol. Otherwise, I guess maybe you can check out the Road to Rank 1 playlist. It has, I think, one Jayce game in it from this season. There's also some in there from last season. So go check all those out. Again, if you did like the video, go ahead and like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.